Hello, Ashanti. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's good to be here.
I'm delighted. You and I had a pre-recording conversation, and as I said to you just before we hit record, I have had you trotting through my brain ever since, which is a delightful thing in all the good ways. So you work in what some might say is at the moment quite a hot or trendy
Hmm.
space, um, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion in the
Yes,
UK and worldwide.
yes.
Can you tell us? Let's start off with talking about how you differentiate yourself and your company from other DEI practitioners.
That's a brilliant question because actually, since our conversation, I've happened to be talking about this more and more with clients. And, you know, first of all, our water is wet messaging is that we help organizations get clear on what their next diversity, equity, and inclusion steps are. That's really on the tin what we do. There's a lot of clarity work that we do with our clients, and that is one of the main things that sets us aside. We are not a training provider, really, although, of course, sometimes part of the intervention that we may suggest requires training. But what we do is we take a very neutral, unbiased, non political approach to the work that we do with organizations. And we're focused on workplace culture. We're focused on creating environments that enable your employees to do the job they've been paid to do.
Yeah.
That's what
And
we
that,
focus on.
when you say it that way, Ashanti, it doesn't sound like something that is optional to me.
No,
It, as you know, we different people have different intersectional specificities. Mine are that I am a woman and that I am neurodivergent AF. So the traditional workplace has had challenges, particularly
yes.
agency life. We all, I won't speak for you, but you also have some specificities that
Hmm.
make you not a white, wealthy man.
Yes.
And so it, it's not an optional thing, and it's also, it can't be a box ticking exercise. And what I hear you saying is that when you say that you're not a training organization, that yeah, you might offer training as part of, but fundamentally you are talking about creating a culture. And you have, I was waiting for you to use the word and you didn't say it, a culture where all employees feel
Exactly.
what?
Feel like they can do the job they've been paid to do without inhibition, without barriers that are
Because
related, obviously, to their identity. That
yeah,
shouldn't be the case. And actually, it's very funny because that includes white males. The conversation now, has moved, unfortunately, to a place, and I can understand why, because there has been a collision of academia, of social justice, activism, and workplace culture work. Because really, the latest modern day milestone was the George Floyd murder. So
mhm.
those things all collided together. And that's not always helpful because, in actual fact, if you identify as a white male, you are very much a part of this conversation. And the work that we do as practitioners should be benefiting them as well. Okay. It is a minority of people in society, in any community, that is white, male, and wealthy. When we look at that top 1% of the global population, it's a minority. Hardly anybody falls into that category. Now, of course, it is true that historically that minority group of people have a hold on resources, access, on power, on authority.
Mhm.
That's absolutely true. But it's really important for us to recognize, first of all, and be clear that if you identify as a male and you are white, for example, you are very much a needed and valuable part of the work that needs to be done.
Thank you for that. Thank you. I feel the record has been set straight, and that is a, a, a critical nuance to even what I just said. So thank you for
Yes.
that. That's really helpful. And you mentioned something there about social justice work. This
Mm,
this unfortunate confluence of events and of movements in society and of shifts in language. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. We'll be talking about brand, the voice of your brand of DEI work, and the importance of language. There have been shifts in language, and some people talk about everyone wants to be identified with this identity or this label, or treated special is what I hear a lot. Treated
Mhm.
specially because all of a sudden everybody has ADHD, which is something I hear a lot as someone who was diagnosed late in life.
Yes.
And I promise you the struggles are not new for people who are diagnosed late in life. So this confluence of the George Floyd murder, thinking about in the UK, the women of color who are going missing, the children who are going missing, and media aren't reporting. I mean, it's just anyone who's not living in a cave will have struggled to miss that there is a whole lot that's going on, and it's quite a live, heated topic. And
Yes.
yet you said to me when we were preparing this conversation that it's really important to you that there is a clear understanding that diversity, equity, and inclusion work is not social justice work. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that many of my peers disagree with this, right? So
So it's a point of differentiation.
yes, I'm well aware that many of my peers disagree with this. I don't believe it has to be social justice work. And I actually think that and when you look at the nature of activism and social justice, for good reason, it has to be agitative. It has to be robust. It has to be, urging, pushing, breaking boundaries. It has to do that. Otherwise, it wouldn't be activism, right? It just
Yeah.
wouldn't work, right? Regardless of the cause. However, in the context of workplaces, those traits, attitudes, methodologies, ways of doing things, if you ever research around what it really takes actually to stage a coup or create a revolution, those traits and methodologies are not helpful in a workplace environment. If everybody approached things in that way, you would have a complete breakdown of an already broken system.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's that element. Two, CEOs and board members, who are the ones making the decisions in businesses, don't, generally speaking, they're not coming from that perspective. That isn't an item line on the agenda when boards meet. Social justice. Generally speaking, it's not. And so it's really key to understand what is on their agenda and speak their language. So this work in the context of the workplace, I'm always very clear, if you're looking at society and communities, then of course social justice is ever relevant. But in the context of a workplace, the marketplace, and the commercial lens that a CEO and a board and senior leaders are taking, you can do this work effectively and efficiently without it being connected to or driven by social justice and activism.
What I'm hearing you say ties back to something that I was hoping you would say earlier, but which is around keeping a workplace safe, right?
Yes.
Giving what you said earlier, giving people the conditions and the circumstances and the tools and the recognition and time, etc. I know that my list is far from exhaustive, in order to be best equipped to do their jobs
Yes.
because they feel safe. And if you are in an environment where there is a lot of conflict and there is a lot of um, you're talking about what it takes to stage a coup, or not saying that activism is coup staging, but
No.
it requires an energy and a level of fire to
Exactly.
create a movement, right? And is the workplace is creating a movement of with that flavor the most effective and way that creates the safest environment for everyone in the workplace of all identities, because that's what you're talking about, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And also, if that does happen, because we saw again post George Floyd, there was a lot of activity coming from employees. In fact, I'd say 75% of organizations, the changes they may have made, or at least the external statements that they made, were driven by an internal push from employees saying, this matters.
Mm.
What are your thoughts on this? What's your stance as an organization? So it can be useful, but for a specific period of time. You can't stay in that methodology, approach, and mindset in the long term in a workplace environment to get the change that you say you want. You have to understand when you need to use that energy, that methodology, and when not to, right?
Mm.
Because when it comes to having a conversation with a CEO or board members and getting them to understand how this actually contributes to business transformations like productivity, reputation, and profitability,
Mm-hmm.
social activism or even the moral case is not the strongest argument to go with. And if it were, we would see better change by now.
You said to me when we were speaking last that you are not particularly attached to the sentimentality or morality of your work. Can you
No.
talk about that a little bit? Because you just touched on it now.
No, not at all. I mean, honestly, as a human being, we all have, varying degrees of consciousness. I
Mm.
can say personally, I can be, and probably was, especially growing up, I would absorb a lot of injustice. I would feel that in my body, right? And as a human being, I would feel I could almost feel the pain of other groups of people who were experiencing injustice on various levels. That can be very wearing. I
Mm.
wouldn't be able to survive as a practitioner. I wouldn't be very useful to my clients if that was my dominant state of mind. That's the first thing. So, as a personal individual, I do a lot of work to be able to obviously keep myself well, but separate the two. Number two, as a practitioner and in my experience, the moral case definitely isn't the strongest. It doesn't move CEOs and boards. We'd all like to think it does, but it doesn't. And so I'm not attached. What I am attached to is making sure that we've helped those leaders, those decision makers, understand what they need to do to ensure that their work environment is one, safe, physically safe, but also obviously intellectually safe for the people they're paying to do a job. So if I was attached to the moral case, this probably wouldn't be the best job to do
Mm.
because half the time, in fact, 95% of the time, we're not really talking about the moral issues and we're not relying on the moral issues to influence, to upskill, to drive change within workplaces.
What importance, as you, I mean, you now have a global network of 45, right?
Yes.
45 diversity, equity, and inclusion consultants who work with you all over the world. It's not
Yeah.
possible for one person to do all of the work that your business does. And so
No.
you have this ever increasing capacity to be hinge for change, right? You're like the roundabout that gets, people are doing things in one way, and there's a culture that doesn't provide safety, that doesn't
Yes.
provide understanding and acceptance, because those are the things that some of the things, and I'm sure just a few of the ingredients that are needed in order for us to
Mm.
feel safe and peaceful enough to do our best work.
Yes.
But as the if you're maybe the this I don't know where this analogy came from, but if you're at the center of that roundabout, right, and
Yes.
you have your consultants around the world who are doing this work,
Yes.
how much time have you spent as you've grown your business, even from day one, thinking about
Mm.
the brand that you were building,
Mhm.
and how did you go about building that brand?
So this is a really good question, and I know you and I talked about this, and it's funny because I don't ordinarily. It was only when you and I started talking that I actually started really actually mulling over what I would say the brand actually is,
Mm.
and I think without a doubt, the brand probably lives more through my voice and through my voice and the delivery of what we do. And that then led to the choosing of the business name that we have right now, the brand name that we have right now, right? So we're called Good Soil Leaders. And that really came from the fact that whenever I'm talking to organizations, the approach, our protocol, our methodology is about digging deep into what's the soil. What's
Mhm.
at the foundation of this organization before we start planting seeds to grow flowers, which is often things like training and recruitment and stuff. Let's look at the soil first and get clear on the health of the soil. And so my brand probably has evolved over the last 10 years through mainly my voice and the fact that I believe that this should be neutral, unbiased work, very focused on clarity and competency. And so yeah, I suppose I haven't taken a traditional approach to building a brand. I didn't think logo first or brand name first. It was more about the way we do things and the way we support the organizations that we work with. I think that's how it evolved upon reflection. And of course, my voice, as I said, I know that many of my peers disagree with the approach I take, particularly the fact that, as I say, I'm not an activist. As an organization, we are not an activist organization. You will see that on my LinkedIn, on our website, we don't necessarily produce content or events around every cultural awareness month there is in the calendar. Like, that's not the work I believe we need to do and should be doing. What I want to focus on is this clarity and competency piece, the nitty gritty, not the activism side of the work that is done in this industry.
There's the focus on the competency and the clarity that
Yes,
you both express, demonstrate, and help your clients' organizations
we do.
get to that clarity,
Yes,
and seeing where their competencies lies, and maybe where they've got, too much clay in their soil, or too many rocks, or gravel, or whatever it is that we
exactly.
want to take the analogy. But there's also, as it has come through your voice, and this is a conversation I often have with my clients, and we haven't had this conversation yet, so I'm interested to hear what you say. One of the things that I will say to my clients without fail is that you are not your brand. And
Mm,
it is obvious that if people book in to work with good soil leaders, they are not getting your earlobe or one of your nostrils. They are not getting Ashanti. They're getting the decades of experience that you have working for massive organizations in the finance industry and other places, and plus your lived experience as a Black person growing up, a woman growing up in the cultures that you grew up in, feeling all of those feelings, having whatever the experiences are that you're having. You bring all of those things into this business, and there are 45 people
yeah,
consulting with you, so it's coming through you, but your brand's voice is not all of you. It
right.
is of you, but it's not you. And
Okay. So thank you, and there's a lot there, and you're right. We haven't had this conversation before. I will share a few things, and I've just made a mental note of the few things I'd love to touch on there. One is, it's interesting about my lived experience because I get asked this a lot. I don't do this work because I'm a Black woman.
no.
I don't. I'm trained, I've got experience in the competencies that you need around coaching, training, facilitating, etc. That's
Mhm.
the reason why I do this work, because those are my strengths and this aligns with my strengths. And therefore, I know we can have the impact
Yeah.
that we need to be having on behalf of employees.
Yeah.
And that's the other thing I always say. We're there to make sure that we can encourage, enable that organization to make the environment safe for employees to do the job they're being paid to do. I do not go in and work on behalf of the organization. Now, the organization benefits, of course, but that's the first thing. So, and then that leads me on to my next point of the detachment from ego. And I think a lot of business owners obviously experience this because lots of people are really attached to maybe the reasons why they started their business and brand and it being based around them. And I think we live in a world in general now, if you think about the way social media and the cult of personality and influencing, generally speaking, people are either encouraged or inclined to build things that are an extension of them, that whether directly or indirectly celebrates them, builds them up, feeds their ego.
Mhm.
And in the work that we do, you need to be detached from ego because you are not going to be the most effective if you need to be the hero or the superstar.
Yeah.
Okay, a large part of what we do is getting to that point where senior leaders believe the idea is their own. They can own that idea and therefore drive it forward. And so ego is something that you have to be very aware of and always be trying to contain in the context of this work that we do. And so you're quite right. I deliberately built this business based on principles that would not revolve around who I am, my lived experience, or even my opinions, actually, quite frankly. It is based obviously on the methodology I've created, but I'm very satisfied at this point that that methodology is neutral and unbiased. It's peer reviewed, etc. The other thing I did want to talk to you, say, actually mention is that, but in terms of me, I guess, and my role, I do take the stewardship of that very seriously. So I guess that's where I still have a role, which is that I do believe that I am credible, capable, and the right person to steward the methodology that we use with organizations. But I don't believe ever it should be of me. Does that
Mm-hmm.
make sense? But I do believe I
Mm-hmm.
am the best person to steward the way we do things.
I love that um, clarification and
Mm,
this idea of stewardship, because when you were talking about ego and this work, I had this image of, if it's someone who's doing the kind of work that you do has an egoic brand or an egoic perspective or approach to this work, then that person becomes a really thick, gloopy mass to move through to get to
yes.
the result that you need. And earlier, I'm really interested because you've been talking about your clients and what your clients need, and saying in the same breath CEOs and board members. But actually, you just said what I was thinking, which is that actually you're hired by the CEOs and the board members, but your clients, the end beneficiaries of your work, are every single person in that company culture.
Exactly.
It's not
Exactly.
about the person XYZ sitting around that board table. It's not yes, getting leveraging the egos that are around that table so that they feel ownership and
Yes.
commitment to this work is part of your magic, your strategy, your approach, your methodology. It's what makes it stick, because otherwise I would assume that you could easily come in and do the work and then leave and nothing really happens. Whereas when they own it, they then carry it, are committed to it. And once we have a commitment as humans, when we've invested time and
Yes.
energy, etc., into an activity or into a perspective or an approach, we're less likely to backtrack.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, you know, when we think about brand, obviously the next part of the conversation sometimes is around legacy. What's your reputation and what's your legacy? And that's why, as I say, it's really important that we stay focused on the way we do things, because the legacy is in the environments that these employees now have to work in, right? And
Yeah.
so it's always about making sure you do no harm, first of all.
Yeah.
And I always think about that in terms of the medical field, always talk
Yeah.
about do no harm. For me, in
Yeah.
diversity, equity, and inclusion work, that is number one. Do
Mm.
no harm, right? Do no harm. And then, you should be contributing to positive trajectory, not actually adding to what's happening. And the problem is, if you are not detached from your ego, if you're not neutral and unbiased, if you don't have that end employee in mind, then you can end up making things worse.
You have spoken about your methodology. Talk to me a little bit about how you use language,
Mm,
because you may not have done the work that my brain's like, oh, I want to get my sticky fingers on the way you do things. You may not have done the work intentionally around, like,
mm,
put a label on it and said, I'm going to work on my brand voice and my messaging at the moment. But I would bet everything that I have that you absolutely have been hellfire intentional on the way that you use language so that it is neutral, and the way you build that roundabout that you move people around and get them flowing through. talk to me just about the language, how you have created the language for your version of DEI work, your methodology, and how you get people, 45 people around the world, plus all of the support team I imagine you have, to
Mm,
get on board and integrate that language?
yeah, absolutely. And that has been, you see, that's the value of, and again, look, there is a very important part that social justice, even academia, plays in these conversations around change, transformation, workplace culture in organizations. However, when you bring up language, that is a contentious thing, mainly because of social justice language,
Okay.
and the way it's circulated on social media, and the way sometimes academic terms are taken out of that context and then used very colloquially. And suddenly people think they're up on the language and they're using it entirely incorrectly or in the wrong context. You take terms like white privilege, for example. I mean, I've never seen a term cause so much contention in people before. And I think one of the main reasons is that a lot of people use it, but they don't understand what it really means, right? Or it's not ever explained in the right context, in the right way to the right groups of people. And so there has been a journey when it comes to language for us as a business. I, from the very beginning, decided that one, we do not provide terminology guides
Mm.
because that does not help that business move forward at all. All it means is that they're always looking to see what the latest meaning or new word might be. That doesn't actually change anything from a cultural perspective in an organization. Secondly, I tend to steer away from using words that I know originate in the field of academia or originate in social justice circles, because what happens is that you are then battling the unseen, which is all the thoughts, connotations, feelings which are very visceral and real to people that
Yeah.
might come up for them when they hear those terms and words. And so
Mm.
we stay away where possible from using those terms, and if we do get asked to do a session on privilege, it's very carefully thought through according to who the participants are. And a lot of time is spent on mindset before we even go into discussing the content, because we are very aware of how language and the way we use language can either alienate people or indeed unite people, right? Language is very powerful. So I'd say it's definitely been a journey from a delivery perspective for us as an organization. Where possible, I try not to even use the terms diversity, equity, and inclusion
Mm.
where possible, right? I talk about workplace behaviors, for example. We will talk about collaborative working. We will use terms that are far more tame generally for people, in terms of their perceptions and how willing they might be to even come into the conversation. We try to stay away from using those terms. And I think, again, the time period we lived in that aftermath of George Floyd, where everybody was at home, everybody was on social media, you know, really did affect, I believe, or create a lot of misunderstanding and misconceptions about this work. Because anybody, then, you could be in a pub, you could be in a cafe, or you could be at home in your front room having a conversation about things that aren't being contextualized, where you're not discussing nuance. There's no real accurate understanding of what's actually being discussed here. And I think that contributed to the confusion, I believe, in the industry and the value we actually can add to workplaces.
It's fascinating to hear you talk about that, because in the work that I do, we're very intentional in with all of the clients with, with the exact words that we use and why we use them. And it feels, the sense I'm getting is that in your work, perhaps more than in other work that I have done with clients in, industries ranging from, sustainable fashion to parent coaching via agricultural consulting and all sorts, it feels especially critical in the work that you do to be ever so mindful, because people need to come into the roundabout, and they need to come in willingly and have their wheels turning and be willing to be in movement and
Yeah.
to find an exit that works for them and their team and their employees, and the, whether it be the people at the around the boardroom table down to the person who's ordering the coffee
Yeah.
cartridges for their whatever. And how I'm fascinated that you would prefer to avoid using the words diversity, equity, and inclusion, because, and I'm not surprised, because at the same time there's a beautiful expression in French which is mot valise, which means suitcase words. Like everything
Mm.
gets, all the meanings, everybody's interpretation gets chucked into these suitcase words. So like collaboration is a big suitcase word, or co-creation is a suitcase, DEI or suitcase, like diversity, equity, inclusion are suitcase words. And everyone brings their own baggage to
Exactly.
these words. And I'm really geekily interested as a linguist by your noticing of, actually it doesn't serve the end
No.
population, so the employees who would really, they deserve a safe workplace culture,
That's all we're doing, right? That's the
right?
bottom line. That's why we're
Yeah,
doing it. And I think that's why it can be very challenging, because when you do take it from a social justice lens in the workplace, and by the way, I'm not saying there's no place for it, it just really does need to be contextualized. But in terms of changing culture, changing systems, and therefore changing outcomes, it's really important that you are using language that is relatable, accessible, understandable. Like that's the basics of inclusion and communication anyway. If no one understands what you're talking about, then this isn't good communication. And a lot of the
absolutely.
time in the room, people do not understand what we're actually talking about. And so we can't really move beyond that. So we have to make sure, first of all, that the language being used is understood, accessible, and clear. Number one, regardless of what you're talking about. Like it needs to be water is wet messaging. And if it's not
Absolutely.
that, you're losing people from the start. I think the other issue as well is that, particularly in this industry, is that you have two things that happen. If you're using language that isn't helpful, right, there's a loftiness that's created, an unachievable goal is then created in people's minds. And then they think, or then they start saying things like that it's a journey, it's not easy to change. Now, whilst those things are true, but there actually is one more step you could take that is achievable for you to make. But because some of these statements and terms and phrases feel so high, it then feels really unachievable for organizations, leaders to reach. And actually, it's not. We can start, there's a ladder here of steps. So I think that's why also language in this work is so important, because otherwise people feel that they can't do it. And if they don't have the capacity, energy, maybe they've never done it before, maybe they don't have the stamina it takes. Organizations need stamina to do this work through the ups and downs. So that's why it's really important to use language that is accessible, clear for them. The other issue we have is if you're too inspirational, it will always sit then in a bucket of nice, feel good. It's all about people's feelings. And again, it is much more visceral, realistic. There's steps on the ladder to get there. So I think those are the other issues you find when the wrong language is being used. It's either too lofty and out of reach, or it's too inspirational and therefore airy fairy. And you can never quite grasp the tangibleness of the work that we do.
It sounds like my brand voice language brain is like, yes, everyone's jumping up and down in the stands cheering for what you're saying. It sounds like you have been really intentional, and I imagine you probably started out this way given some of the things you've said to me before, and I imagine that has only deepened in its complexity and in its application. But you have found the approach and the language that opens doors wide, instead of like people cracking them open, being afraid of what they hear and see, being afraid that they might do it wrong, feeling overwhelmed, and just slamming the door. Like, no, I can't, because it's too woolly, or it's too lofty, or it's too complicated, or I'm tired already. And it's not my problem, right? All of the things that when the intensity isn't not only the words chosen, but the intensity of the communication isn't titrated to the people on the other side, then that is actually an impediment to communication. And that's true for the work that you do when you're approaching the board, but it's also true for us, everyone who has a business who does any kind of marketing. If you go out and you fire hose with intensity, you're very likely to have people who are your ideal clients going, whoa, no, too much. Or conversely, if you have this really complex, like, you know, light show with fountains going off all over the place, that's not what they don't need. A fancy light show. They just need the first step to make their workplace
Yeah.
safer.
First step
Yeah.
or the next step, right? That's
Yeah.
all they really need. Once that's understood, you see things move so much more faster,
Mm.
and you're going to see very tangible results. That's
Mm.
and I think, there have been times over the years where, I have maybe had self doubt around our methodology because of its simplicity.
Mm.
And the methodology is simple, but it does require a certain level of competency and skill to
Mm-hmm.
deploy successfully. And that's what time has taught me.
Mm.
Whereas sometimes some of my colleagues are writing books, research papers, or they, sharing think pieces on LinkedIn as part of their marketing, I don't engage in that because I know from experience that all it requires is our methodology, which often happens behind closed doors anyway, with these decision makers and stakeholders within organizations. And so I think there have been times where maybe I have not been as confident about our brand voice because of what I see other people commonly doing in the space, right?
Mm.
But with time, I have realized that this is actually more important, at
And
least in
it's
my view. This is the part that's more important and it's more effective. So I try not to be distracted by, people applying for awards or writing books or being listed on the top 10 DEI practitioners, that kind of thing, because quite frankly, it can be distracting and it can make you almost second guess potentially the approach that we take. But actually, I think about the legacy that we are leaving in these organizations. For example, we have some HR directors we've worked with who moved to other organizations, and the work they now do in that organization has been influenced by the coaching and upskilling they received from us.
Yeah.
And that is a massive impact to have a HR director, particularly white female HR directors, because they make up 80% of HR, for example. And HR obviously is the least popular function in any business.
Mm.
The impact that we are having, that's the legacy we're leaving, because that HR director moves forward far more competent and clearer on what the real issues are, but more importantly, knows how to approach them.
And who to ask for help
So
if the culture isn't working.
exactly. And that is an ego piece for me. That's why I said about that constant thinking about ego, because when I focus more on the impact and legacy we're having, I focus less on whether I should be spending time applying for awards, writing books, or getting onto these lists, because that's ego leading in that instance, not actually me thinking about the legacy of what we do.
Tell me how much time you now, or historically, or as a business, spend doing what we would most commonly call marketing activities. For
Mm,
example, creating social media content. You mentioned think pieces on LinkedIn. You mentioned asking, applying for awards, which is funny because you've been a
mm.
judge on a squadrillion award panels. So I think that's kind of funny as well.
Yeah,
So you're sort of participating in it, but not feeling the need to seek the
yes.
validation. So email list building, funnel creation, all the things that we're told are absolutely essential, and that I see so many of my clients spending endless time doing all of these things. How much time have you spent in growing of your hugely profitable business of 45 consultants around the world? I'm saying hugely. I don't actually know your financials, but I know it's profitable because you've told
Yeah,
me.
we are profitable. So I would say when I started the business 10 years ago, I obviously was misguided. And again, you can be distracted by what people tell you need to
Mhm.
do to build a business. When in actual fact, they're just keeping you busy. It doesn't bring money in. But I would say since I matured as an entrepreneur specifically, over the last 3, 4 years, I do very little actual social media creation of content. Now, I do have 2 podcasts, but for me, those are sales tools, not marketing tools. So the goal, and I don't put any effort into widening my listenership on those podcasts because I use them in the sales process with prospective clients and I use them post sale in terms of their education and awareness. So I don't can't tell you the last time I even looked to see how many downloads we actually have, but I know that we're winning really not only lucrative from a business perspective, but really important pieces of work. And a lot of the time, it is because my brand voice obviously comes through very clearly in that podcast content. And so, what I'll find is a HR director and even a CEO will say, "Oh, I listened to your podcast on XYZ, and you said, can I ask you about that?" Or that let me know a bit more about your approach.
Mm-hmm.
And after that, I don't really have to do any selling. It's more of a case of how do you want to work with us? So also, again, as an entrepreneur and from a business building perspective, that stuff wastes a lot of time. Look, unless you're in a product business or you sell direct to consumer, for example, we don't. We're a B2B business, and our decision makers aren't scrolling on Instagram or even LinkedIn, quite frankly, just waiting for a post from me to come up. They're not, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, they're often confused, they're often under pressure, and what really works is rapport building with them over time. The expert at hand is the expert that gets hired.
Yeah.
And so my job is to make sure I'm at hand. Whether they are working with us or not, I'm at hand providing valuable advice or information. And that's usually how we make sales.
And how are you at hand? I can hear someone thinking, how is she at hand?
Yes.
How does she get that business if she doesn't? She has a podcast, but she's not promoting it, and she's not on socials. And
Okay, so
what?
I'd say the key things, just looking at this year, for example, is speaking at events just where my decision makers are. So a
Mm.
lot of people end up going to events where their peers are. Well, they're not going to buy from you. That's a waste of time. I go and speak at events where my decision makers are. And not only do my goal is never to speak as a keynote speaker, never. My goal is to get them to give me a roundtable or seminar slot because I can use my brand voice in those more intimate situations with a group of 10 decision makers and convert at least 3 sales from that one conversation. So you really want to be where your decision makers are, and the more intimate you can get, the better.
Mm.
So that's one of my key lead generation activities is speaking in a seminar or a roundtable, an intimate exchange with decision makers. The second thing that I do is I do run executive forums. So I will do a virtual or in-person executive forum just for our target decision makers on a topic I know is relevant to them, and I'll invite them along. It's free. They exchange, we may provide a bit of information, and then we use that to generate leads. So, those I would say are the 2 main things that I use. And then the third one I would say is I probably network a lot, to be fair. I do go out and network, but again, it's very targeted and selective. It's in spaces where a head of HR, a COO, a CFO is. I don't really network with people who do what I do, and when I say I don't network, I don't, not for lead generation. I'm being
Yeah.
very specific here, not for lead generation. So it's targeted networking, hosting executive forums and adding value, and then speaking specifically at roundtables and seminars at events within the industry I'm targeting.
I love that tip of
Yeah.
a smaller audience where you're able to have more intimate conversations, build a
Yes.
better and more direct rapport is a
Yes.
million percent more likely to convert than the ego boosting, standing in front of a
Yeah.
crowd of 2,000 people where you have 30 people coming to ask you questions and you make no sales.
And half the time, quite frankly, in the keynote speaking room, people are there because they have to be there or they're resting. Like, not everybody in that room is
Yeah.
necessarily interested in the talk that's actually happening. The
Mm-hmm.
other thing is that, look, keynote speaking is a skill. And it depends on whether the speaker has been paid in advance or they're doing it for free as to whether or not they can actually do a sales pitch or use it to generate leads anyway. So it can be quite limiting, keynote talks, depending upon the logistics and the arrangements that happen behind closed doors. And thirdly, as you can probably tell, my brand voice isn't about charisma or inspiration, right? It's
Mm.
not something that, that's not what I am providing my clients with. And I always tell them that I'm not here to inspire you. Competency and clarity will help you get active. And so, generally speaking, I'm not the best keynote speaker in this space because I find it frustrating that we're talking about things to inspire people. I'm like, let's get to the nitty gritty of what
Yeah.
we actually need to do next. And so I'm not necessarily suited to keynote speaking as well because I don't have. I choose. I guess I just don't have that pizzazz. I don't care for it. I'm very much about let's get to the root of the issue, and that's one of the reasons why a CEO will give me time because they know that we're only putting 20 minutes into the diary. There's an agenda for the 20 minutes. We get through the agenda. I'm not there to waste time, take up too much time, and talk about things that aren't relevant.
And blow smoke up anyone's backside.
Exactly. But that's
Yeah.
just my style. And I guess that is, again, part of our brand voice that
Yeah.
sets us apart, I would say, from our peers.
Ashanti, I could talk to you about this all day. However, I know that you have a profitable business to run and other things to do. So I am so grateful for you taking the time today. Thank you for your perspective. Thank you for sharing that important piece around being really mindful about how you spend the time that you are marketing and making sure you're reaching the decision makers fewer
Yes.
but closer and better for more
Yeah.
conversions.
And what I would say is that, I mean, I know marketing has its place depending on the business you run and the sector you're in, but if you think money, you will realize that most of the things on your task list don't lead you to money.
Yep.
That's the real reality of it. When you look at your task list, you think, well, that's not leading me to money. That's not. So whatever leads you straight to the money, which is usually sending an email, making a phone call, those things lead to money. Getting on a call, video call, phone call with someone who has the decision to decide whether or not to work with you is really your number one priority every single day in business.
Yeah, sending those invoices, making sure things are
Yes,
followed up, the processes, all of that
exactly.
stuff. It
Yeah,
ain't sexy, but boy, does it bring in the cash.
it does.
Yeah. Ashanti, you've been an absolute delight. Thank you for being on the show today.
Thank you.